Is Israel obstructing aid deliveries to Gaza? The UN says Palestinians there are on the brink of starvation. That's even after the International Court of Justice ordered Israel to allow humanitarian assistance into the Strip. So who can force it to comply? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the program. I am Hashem Ahelbarra. The United Nations is warning that Gaza is on the brink of famine. Israel is accused of preventing humanitarian aid from reaching Palestinians. And UNRWA, the main UN agency operating in the Strip, may be forced to stop all its operations unless donor nations that suspended funding resume their contributions. All this comes just weeks after the International Court of Justice ordered Israel to allow, and I quote, urgently needed basic services and humanitarian assistance into the Strip. So what, if anything, can be done to force Israel to comply with the ruling? There's plenty to discuss with our guests, but first, this report looks at the situation on the ground in Gaza.
Palestinians in Gaza are living in desperate conditions.
The children of North Gaza are dying of hunger. There is no milk for them. There is no sugar for them. There is no rice for them. There is no flour for them. Hunger is killing us. I ate only little pieces of bread today. We are reduced to eating grass.
On January the 26th, the International Court of Justice ordered Israel to take immediate steps to enable the provision of urgently needed basic services and humanitarian assistance into Gaza. But those living inside the territory say the ruling is little more than empty words.
There's nothing except shelling and bombardment and hunger. My children cry because they are hungry. We did not receive any humanitarian aid.
A day after the court's decision, Israel accused 12 employees of the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees, UNRWA, of taking part in Hamas attacks on southern Israel in October. The staff were fired and an investigation was opened. But it wasn't enough to reassure some donor nations. About 20 countries have suspended funding to UNRWA or said that they would reassess future pledges. The UN agency has warned it may not be able to continue its work after the end of February, which would cut the only lifeline to millions of Palestinians.
If the Palestinian people lose UNRWA's assistance, we're as good as dead. As good as dead. We have nothing but UNRWA. We're already living in the streets.
There are 3 border crossings into Gaza, 2 with Israel and 1 with Egypt, although Israel inspects all people and goods coming in or out of the territory through Egypt. Both countries are accused of holding up aid deliveries.
Sisi did not want to open up the gate to allow humanitarian material to get in. I talked to him. I convinced him to open the gate.
The Egyptian government vehemently denies it. As the war drags on, UN leaders have described the volume of aid entering Gaza as a trickle in comparison to the sea of humanitarian need. Veronica Pedroza, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
We will talk to our guests in a moment, but first let's listen to Fidaa Araj, who I spoke to earlier. She's the Gender, Justice and Protection Officer at the charity Oxfam. Fidaa joined me from Rafah in southern Gaza, where Israel is threatening a large-scale ground offensive. I began by asking her about the humanitarian situation there.
The humanitarian situation in Rafah is worsening by the minute. We are talking about a very limited geographical area, housing more than 1.5 million IDPs, most of which are staying in tents. There is a very severe lack of access to water, drinking water, domestic water, severe inability to access food. This all comes into a very cold winter where the living conditions are very deteriorated. We have a very huge need for medical care, for healthcare facilities, which are overburdened to start with. And the burden on these facilities is increasing, especially after last night's attacks that took tens of lives and left hundreds injured, and even in more grave situation regarding their shelter. Many people lost their meager shelters last night, and unfortunately we expect that to worsen even more in the upcoming days and weeks if this is not stopped.
The Israeli army is preparing for its ground offensive in Rafah. Give us a sense of the risks for the civilian population if that operation starts.
We are fearing for our lives, basically. Then there's the prospect of having to relocate yet again to seek a safer place. And as I said before, Rafah is very limited geographically, so there is barely any place to go to that would be away from the ground incursion way if it happened.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu promised to offer Palestinians in Rafah a safe passage to northern areas. Would it make any difference, given the fact that in the past those safe passages were bombarded by the Israelis relentlessly?
Everywhere you walk in Rafah, you have the feeling that tents spring from the ground and are erected as you walk. This is how crowded it is. So I would really like to see what's a safe passage will look like. Where would it lead us? I don't think it's possible at all.
Israel is under obligation to comply with the International Court of Justice's orders, particularly when it comes to allowing immediate and quick aid into the Strip. As a worker there, could you give us a sense of the aid which is now trickling into Gaza? Is it enough?
Actually, it's nowhere near enough. It's hardly a drop in the ocean of all of the needs. I've been working as a humanitarian for the past 18 years, and to start with, Gaza has been under siege for 16 years, and it's always been a challenge to get supplies into Gaza. But what we're witnessing now, what we're living now, is unprecedented. We barely get anything. We barely could get any trucks of aid.
Fidaa, as you said, you've been working as an aid worker for many, many years in Gaza. I would like to ask you a personal question. You have your own family, you have your children. What's next for you if the ground invasion starts in Rafah?
Actually, it's not a very easy question to answer, since I've been asking it to myself for the past month or so. I've been thinking, I'm a mother of 5 kids, and of course I feel responsible for their life, for their safety, but I really can't decide what to do. I try to plan to find a safer place, or a less deadly place, let's say, because safer is a very exaggerated word. I don't know, actually, to be honest, if I will find such a place, and if I find such a place, how will I manage a shelter? What would I do? Build up a tent? How will I move there? Will I be able to move? For example, last night we thought it was a land incursion, and I was faced with my children waking up at 3 a.m. and they were just panicking, like, let's move. And I honestly froze. I didn't know how to move, where the strikes were coming from. Do I take the risk to go in the street and move, or do I stay and wait and risk being hit? So it's very, very difficult question that we keep asking ourselves every day. And we just hope that someone will manage to stop all of this before an actual ground invasion, because it's really, it seems like the end of the line for everyone here in Rafah.
Let's bring in our guests from New Haven, Connecticut. We're joined by Ardi Imseis, a professor of international law at Queen's University and author of the United Nations and the question of Palestine. And in London is Chris Gunness, former spokesperson for UNRWA, who is speaking to us in an independent capacity. Welcome to the program. Ardi, Israel has until February 23rd to report to the ICJ on what it has done to comply with the 6 orders it issued. Today we're putting more emphasis on the humanitarian aspect. Do you believe that Israel is doing all it takes to ensure steady, consistent delivery of aid into the Strip?
Well, thanks for having me, Hashem. In short, no. Since the provisional measures order of the ICJ was issued on the 26th of January, there have been 17 massacres committed in the Gaza Strip, 2,000 killed, 2,000 Palestinians killed, of course, and obviously a severe intensification of the situation in the south. We now have 1.4 million Palestinians pushed towards the south on the border with the Egyptian Sinai, and the prospect of permanent forcible transfer of this community into Egypt, either through direct bombardment and inertia that compels that result, or over time through starvation used as a method of war, and the cutting off of humanitarian aid and assistance to this community looms large. The situation on the ground is tremendously difficult, on the order of a Nakba of the sort that we saw in 1948 and beyond.
Chris, you would expect that under the orders issued by the ICJ, the focus would be pretty much on delivering aid, ensuring that the situation is contained. However, Israel appears to be now preparing for its ground offensive. United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres said and warned that the Israeli invasion would exponentially, I'm quoting him, increase what is already a humanitarian nightmare. What would be next for Gaza if that operation starts?
Well, to be very clear, we are already seeing starvation on a mass scale. Martin Griffiths, the most senior humanitarian in the UN system, has said, and this was several weeks ago, that 400,000 people are literally starving. And to be clear, starvation is a slow-motion massacre. Ardi has mentioned the number of massacres that we've seen since this provisional measures order, but the bigger massacre is the starvation. And to be clear, those member states who are presently defunding UNRWA are complicit in that slow-motion massacre. They were already complicit in a violation of the Genocide Convention, which makes it an obligation on state parties to prevent genocide. The clue is in the name, the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide. But there are 3 other illegalities. First of all, as Ardi has quite rightly said, it's a violation of the provisional measures. Thirdly, it is a violation of international humanitarian law, which is very clear that food cannot be used as a weapon of war. And there are many other, by the way, IHL violations that we're now seeing, including provisions for the protection of civilians in time of war. And very fourthly, it is a violation of humanitarian principles, neutrality and impartiality, which is why I say that the illogical, illegal, immoral defunding of UNRWA needs to be ended immediately, and the civilians need to be got out of harm's way. Now, this Israeli offer to give them safe passage to the north, we know what Israeli safe passage means. It means further killings on an industrial scale. What needs to happen is that the Negev, Israel as the occupying power, needs to protect the population, which is not just under its protection, it's under its bombs. It's committing what the ICJ has called a plausible genocide against 2.3 million people. What needs to happen is that Israel needs to open up and give protection to these people immediately.
Ardi, activists have been saying that since the ICJ is there to referee disputes between nations, because of the relentless bombardment, the targeting of healthcare facilities, ambulances, the access roads, this could be a strong case for the ICC to prosecute Israeli soldiers, officials, for atrocities committed against the people of Gaza. Are you of that view? Should that be a case to be prosecuted?
I am, but we know that the Office of the Prosecutor has a file open. He's investigating the situation in Palestine. Sadly, he's been taking a horribly long time, inordinately so. But all of the events that we've seen unfold in the occupied Gaza Strip and indeed in the occupied Palestinian territory since 7 October and before are now increasingly before his team in The Hague. And so there's no reason not to believe that the matter is more urgent for the Office of the Prosecutor, which he should be moving as soon as possible. I think I'd like to also offer the following. There are about 7 border crossings of the Gaza Strip, generally 1 into Egypt and 6 others into Israel. And the point that was raised by Chris is an extremely important one. That is to say, if the Israelis are so concerned about the 1.5 million people or more in the Gaza Strip who may be subjected to bombardment and want to remove them somehow and provide them with safe passage, not only is the Negev the obvious place for them to go, but viewers need to understand that upwards of about 80% or thereabouts of the population of the Gaza Strip are themselves not from Gaza. They are Palestine refugees registered with UNRWA, and they originate, either original refugees or their descendants, they originate from those refugees who were ethnically cleansed in 1948 from areas in what is now Israel, including the Negev. And so it wouldn't be out of the ordinary for the Israelis to allow those people back to their homes. Indeed, it's a requirement under international law for the Israelis to allow those people to return to their homes. And in this case, under bombardment, the world is on its head, all a result of the complete disproportionate, unnecessary response to the October 7 attack against Israel.
Chris, I guess the backdrop of the apocalyptic situation that you can see unfold in Gaza, activists have been saying basically that you need more than 500 trucks to be crossing into Gaza on a daily basis to cope with the massive demands of the people. Now, US President Biden took the world by surprise when he said it was him who convinced Egyptian President Sisi to open the Rafah crossing. Then the Israelis are saying at the same time they have their own unit, the COGAT, which liaises with the United Nations when it comes to the delivery of aid, and which basically says that the reason why we are being meticulous is that we'd like to ensure that food deliveries don't end up being in the hands of Hamas. Practically, we're talking about people who have to wait weeks and weeks and months because the mechanism itself is not working. Is it a politically motivated thing?
If that question's addressed to me, Hashem, I would say an unequivocal yes. Of course, this is all politically motivated. And to be very clear, this is the political agenda of the far fascist right in Israel. You don't have to be a conspiracy theorist. You can just Google it. Look at the things that are being said about ethnically cleansing Gaza, about destroying life in Gaza, preventing any kind of return to Gaza. So make no mistake, what lies behind this is the notion that if you destroy UNRWA, if you destroy Gaza, then somehow you're getting rid of the Palestinian refugees and their right of return. Now, to be clear, on the getting rid of UNRWA, it is the UN General Assembly which hands down UNRWA's mandate as a subsidiary organ of the General Assembly, and only the General Assembly can change UNRWA's mandate. But secondly, the Palestine refugees are people. They have inalienable rights, both group, individual, and collective rights. And those rights also include the right, political rights of self-determination. Of course, as refugees, they can make 3 choices, including the right of return, integration where they are, or safe passage to a third country. So, getting rid of UNRWA, forcing these refugees to another part of the world, that does not get rid of the big problem here for the Israeli fascistic right, which is that they are individuals, they are people with group and collective rights, and getting rid of UNRWA or pushing them out, displacing them to some other part, that doesn't change the fact that they are people with rights, the right to dignity, the right to justice, the right to accountability, the right to prosperity, and the right to self-determination. And that remains. They're human beings.
Ardi, you see the pictures of the people suffering in Gaza, and then the question begs itself once again, who is to be held accountable for the the slow delivery of aid into the Strip? Is it the Israeli army? Is it the neighbors? Is it the international community? Or is it just simply bureaucratic hurdles?
Yeah, I mean, in the first instance, Hashem, it would be the Israelis as occupying power in the Gaza Strip. They have an obligation to, this sounds rather odd in the circumstances, but their obligations under international are to protect the civilian Palestinian population in the Gaza Strip, not bombard them indiscriminately and use starvation against them as a tool of war. So in the first instance, under international law, it's the Israelis who have the obligation to protect that population, including through the provision of humanitarian aid sufficient to scale and so on, as per not only the ICJ Provisional Measures Order of 26 January, but general public international law, belligerent occupation, the Fourth Geneva Convention, and so on. But in addition to that, you have third states who have an obligation to, quote, ensure that Israel respect the terms of humanitarian law, Common Article 1 of the Four Geneva Conventions, as well as under the Provisional Measures Order of 26 January. They have an obligation, as Chris said earlier, to prevent the commission of genocide. And that means providing means and ways to ensure greater humanitarian support to the Palestinian people in the Gaza Strip, not less. And therefore, the defunding of UNRWA runs counter to their obligations under the Genocide Convention. I just wanted to offer the following based on what Chris had just said, though. We have evidence 3 days after the Provisional Measures Order was issued by the court. We have clear evidence in the public realm of a conference taking place by the Israeli far right in Jerusalem called the quote-unquote Return to Gaza Conference, at which at least, I think, 11 ministers of government appeared and 15 members of government of cabinet, they were there. And in this conference, there are open calls by multiple members of the Israeli body politic, as well as governing structures, saying that basically we want to return, that is, return Israeli settlers to the Gaza Strip after we ethnically cleanse the Gaza Strip. Lost in these 4-month period of coverage over the Gaza Strip is the simple truth that Israel is using the events of 7 October as a pretext to ethnically cleanse 2.2 million Palestinians, or as many of them as possible, out of the Gaza Strip. This is a strategic goal of Israel. They've been open and public about their interests in doing so, and their actions on the ground, their military actions and so on, now the subject of a Provisional Measures Order under the Genocide Convention of the ICJ, demonstrate all of that. So the story really is about how to stave off, to stop the ethnic cleansing of the Gaza Strip, and even worse, the possible genocide of the people there.
Chris, when you look at the orders issued by the ICJ, it was, I mean, obvious that two key components were factoring when it comes to the decision-making process. Basically, they wanted to make sure that there was no genocidal intent and that aid goes to Gaza. What's next for Gazans? And this is why I'm not asking you about UNRWA. How do you see the future for Gaza now that the humanitarian aid lifeline, UNRWA, hangs by a thread?
Well, first of all, on this question of the ICC, the ICJ, I see accountability as a very broad canvas. So yes, there's the ICJ, which adjudicates disputes between states. There's the ICC, which can bring cases against individuals. But there's also the work being done in national jurisdictions. Just today, we had, or was it yesterday, we had a ruling in Holland over arms supplies. It's clear that there's economic pressures. Turkey recently downgraded the economic relationship with Israel. So there are many other things going on across the board. I think as far as the people in Gaza are concerned, I think the future is bleak. And I think that while you have a situation where the international community, countries like my own, Britain, the United States, Canada, are prepared, A, on the one hand, to continue supplying weapons, as well as diplomatic and political support through the United Nations. We've seen this in the Security Council also, but at the same time defund the very organization established by the United Nations to bring humanitarian relief and assistance to these people, then I think there is a real problem. But to be clear, the Palestinians been here before. These are people with extraordinary resilience. I hate to use that word resilience in the face of a plausible genocide. But the fact is that you cannot rob a people of their dignity. You cannot rob a people of their identity and their destiny, frankly. And you cannot do that simply by subjecting them to what's going on. They will outlive this, terrible, terrible as it might seem at the moment.
Since both of you mentioned the moral legal obligations of the third parties, I'll go to Ardi first. Ardi, South African lawyers are hoping to return back at the end of this month to the ICJ and say that basically, given the track record of the ICJ refereeing disputes between nations, there is the potential for them to say, wait a second, if the Americans, the Brits, the Europeans are not able to use their leverage with the Israelis in terms of telling them it's about time to stop the war, it's about time to deliver aid, that could be a case for them to prosecute those nations for their inaction and not willing to move forward. Could that be a practical case to follow?
Yes, in short, yes. As I said earlier, all signatories to the, all parties to the Genocide Convention have an obligation to prevent. And the moment that they were put on notice by the court on the 26th of January of the plausibility of genocide taking place is the moment that, based on the court's jurisprudence, their obligation to prevent is triggered. Now, to the extent that those third states, Canada and others, the UK, France and others, Canada, the United States, do not take effective measures to prevent, they expose themselves to possible cases brought by other states, including South Africa, but not exclusively to South Africa. Other parties to the convention can bring claims against them before the court, basically saying that you failed in your duty to prevent. The Nicaraguans, for instance, have now attempted to join, or rather to intervene in the South African matter with Israel. That's just an example. So it is possible that you can have further litigation before the court. It would depend on the third state in question. Some of these states have sort of objected to the jurisdiction of the court with declarations submitted before the court that predate the South African matter, but there are some states who are exposed. That is a possibility.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we're running out of time. I really appreciate your time, Ardi, Imseis, and Chris Gunness. Thank you very much indeed. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Hashem Ahelbarra, and the entire team here in Doha. Bye for now.